The world was asleep, and the church was its comfortable bed. But something was stirring, a quiet rebellion that had been simmering for centuries. It began with a single finger raised in protest against a self-assured and worldly Christianity. This finger belonged to the monks, those brave souls who dared to question the comfortable theology of glory that had taken root in the church. Imagine a time when the church was a powerful institution, influencing every aspect of life. It was a time when the world was seen as a place to be dominated, and the kingdom of God was thought to be within reach, if only you followed the right rules and rituals. But there were those who saw through this facade. They saw that the church had become too comfortable, too worldly, and too detached from the true message of Christ. One of the earliest and most influential of these protesters was Benedict of Nursia. He founded monasteries where monks could live a life of simplicity, prayer, and service. Benedict's message was clear. The kingdom of God cannot be achieved cheaply. It requires sacrifice, discipline, and a deep commitment to the spiritual life. This was a stark contrast to the opulence and power that the church had come to represent. The monastic movement continued to evolve with the Cluniac reform in the 10th century and the Franciscan movement in the 13th century. Francis of Assisi, in particular, was a powerful voice for change. He lived a life of poverty and service, reminding the world that true Christianity was about love, not wealth and power. But even Francis and his followers, the Franciscans and Dominicans, eventually became part of the very system they had once challenged. They were celebrated and integrated into the church, their radical message watered down and made palatable. The world took notice of the monastic protest, but it also found a way to silence it. It offered a place for asceticism, a way for the brave and the committed to live out their beliefs. But this was a hollow victory. The church had co-opted the monastic movement, turning it into just another part of its vast triumphing structure. Yet, the spirit of protest did not die. It found new expressions, new voices. One of the most significant was the Reformation, which can be seen as an extension of the monastic line. The Reformation brought to the forefront the question of true penitence, a question that had always been at the heart of monasticism. It challenged the church to return to its roots, to embrace the theology of the cross, which emphasizes suffering and sacrifice over glory and triumph. To understand the depth of this movement, we must look back to the innumerable traces left by Augustine, one of the most influential figures in the Western Church. Augustine's teachings, particularly his emphasis on the transcendence of God and a doctrine of predestination, had a profound impact on the Church. His ideas were carried forward by thinkers like John Scotus, Erigena, and Eckhart. These men kept the flame of vertical theology alive, even as the church became increasingly horizontal, focused on earthly power and influence. Another important figure in this story is Duns Scotus, a 13th century theologian who questioned the unity of reason and revelation. He argued that we cannot use reason to prove or understand God. This idea was taken even further by William of Ockham, who introduced the concept of nominalism, the belief that only individual things are real, and that the concepts we use to understand the world exist only in our minds. These ideas created a gap in the medieval understanding of God, a gap that would later be filled by the Reformation. The Reformation was not just a break from the past. It was a continuation of a long tradition of protest and reform. It built on the monastic, Augustinian, and nominalist traditions, bringing them together in a powerful movement that sought to return the church to its true purpose. The Reformation was a call to return to the cross, to embrace the theology of the cross, and to reject the theology of glory. But the story does not end there. The spirit of protest continued to find new expressions. In the form of mysticism, mystics like Hugh of St. Victor, Bernard of Clairvaux, Bonaventura, Meister Eckhart, and Thomas à Kempis sought a deeper, more personal relationship with God. They believed that true spirituality could not be contained by the structures and rituals of the Church. They sought a direct, intimate experience of God, a path that was both challenging and rewarding. The finger of protest had been raised, and it would not be silenced. It would continue to point, to question, and to challenge. The world would never be the same. Imagine a time when people believed that to truly understand God, they needed to strip away everything in their lives and focus solely on the divine. This idea was at the heart of medieval mysticism, a spiritual movement that sought a direct personal connection with God. However, this approach had its critics, and one of the most significant was Martin Luther, a key figure in the Reformation. Luther, despite his criticisms, was deeply influenced by mysticism. He saw the value in the mystics' deep longing for God, but he also recognized the dangers in their methods. Let's explore how Luther's views on mysticism shaped the Reformation and how these two seemingly different paths intersected. Mystics believed that to truly know God, they needed to experience a direct, unmediated connection with the divine. They often used vivid and sometimes extreme language to describe this union, like the soul being one with God or the birth of God within the soul. While this might sound beautiful, it also had a dangerous side. Some mystics, like Meister Eckhart, spoke of the soul's ground where it is one with God, or they translated the Trinity into the soul's religious processes. This could easily be misunderstood as a form of religious arrogance, where people thought they could become like God. Luther saw this as a problem. He believed that the desire for immediacy, or a direct connection with God, was noble but misguided. He argued that this desire could lead to a theology of glory, where people thought they could achieve a perfect state of union with God through their own efforts. Luther, on the other hand, preached a theology of the cross, which emphasized that true connection with God comes through the crucified Christ, not through human striving. Mystics often focused on the historical figure of Jesus, but their understanding was different from Luther's. They saw Jesus as a model of piety and virtue, a perfect example to follow. This led to a misunderstanding of Jesus' role. For the mystics, Jesus was a pious man, someone to emulate. But for Luther, Jesus was the crucified Christ, the one who took on the sins of the world and was judged by God. Luther's Jesus was not a model to follow, but a savior to trust. The mystics' Jesus was a gentle, humble, and merciful man. But Luther's Jesus was the one who faced judgment and death. This difference was crucial. Luther believed that only through faith in the crucified Christ could people truly find salvation and a connection with God. The mystics' focus on imitation and piety, while noble, could not lead to the kind of transformation that Luther believed was necessary. One of the key principles in mysticism is abnegation, the act of denying oneself. Mystics believed that to truly connect with God, one had to give up all earthly desires and attachments. This could involve practices like isolation, simplicity, and obedience. However, Luther saw this as a form of works righteousness, where people tried to earn their way to God through their own efforts. Luther's approach was different. He believed that true self-denial was not a practice, but a state of being. It was not about doing certain things to become closer to God, but about recognizing that we are sinners and can only be saved by God's grace. This is why Luther emphasized faith over works. He saw the mystics' methods as a form of self-righteousness, but he also recognized the value in their deep spiritual longing. Despite his criticisms, Luther was influenced by mysticism. He saw the deep spiritual longing and the sense of urgency that the mystics brought to their faith. He recognized that the problem of connecting with God was a real and pressing issue, and he sought to address it in a new way. Luther's theology of the cross was a response to the mystics' theology of glory. He believed that true connection with God comes through the crucified Christ, not through human effort. He saw the mystics' deep spiritual longing as a sign of the human need for God, but he also recognized that this need could only be met through faith in Jesus. In the end, Luther and the mystics shared a common goal, a deep personal connection with God. However, they differed in their methods and understanding of how to achieve this connection. Luther's Reformation was a new way of addressing the age-old question of how to find God, and it was shaped in part by his engagement with the mystics. By understanding the relationship between Luther and the mystics, we can see how the Reformation was not just a rejection of the past, but a rethinking of it. Luther's theology was both a critique and a continuation of the spiritual traditions that came before him. The Renaissance was a time of great change and new ideas, setting the stage for the Reformation. Unlike the other forces that led to the Reformation, monasticism, Augustinianism, nominalism, and mysticism, the Renaissance had a different relationship with the Reformation. These other forces had a more direct and spiritual connection to the Reformation, leading to a deep understanding of the theology of the cross, which emphasized the vertical relationship between God and humans. The Renaissance, on the other hand, was more focused on the horizontal, or the human world. The Renaissance brought a renewed interest in the ancient world, including the Bible and the works of Augustine and Plato. This interest helped people like Martin Luther rediscover the original texts and ideas that had been lost or forgotten. However, the Renaissance itself did not intend to bring about the Reformation. The great thinkers of the Renaissance, such as Erasmus and Lefebvre d'Etaples, were deeply interested in the Bible, but they were frightened by the radical ideas that emerged, such as the idea of the bondage of the will and the break with church tradition. They did not support the Reformation in its Lutheran or Reformed forms. The Renaissance was more interested in the human world, the horizontal, and this focus continued the medieval idea of progress. Both the Middle Ages and the modern period believed in a goal that could be achieved through human effort. The Middle Ages aimed for a goal in the upper world, like paradise, while the modern period aims for goals in the known world, such as scientific and technological advancements. The enthusiasm of the Middle Ages for reaching the divine was replaced by the modern enthusiasm for understanding and controlling the natural world. The Renaissance figures like Erasmus, Paracelsus, Machiavelli, and Giordano Bruno were key in shaping this new focus on the human world. Erasmus, for example, was the first modern theologian, emphasizing rational thinking and humanism. Paracelsus believed that God worked through humans to perform miracles. Machiavelli studied the state as a scientist, and Giordano Bruno challenged the medieval idea of a separate spiritual world, suggesting that God and the material world were one. The Renaissance did not directly support the Reformation, but it did challenge the Reformation to answer a crucial question. What does the vertical relationship with God mean for the horizontal human world? This question was essential for the Reformation's development. The Renaissance, with its focus on humanism and the natural world, forced the Reformation to address how the theology of the cross, which emphasizes God's grace and human sin, fits into the broader human experience. Zwingli and Calvin, influenced by the Renaissance, took up this challenge. They combined the insights of the Reformation with the humanistic ideas of the Renaissance, leading to a more complete and nuanced understanding of the relationship between God and humanity. This second phase of the Reformation, led by Zwingli and Calvin, eventually brought the movement back to a focus on the human world, but in a way that was more aligned with the Reformation's core principles. The pre-reformers, such as Bradwardine, Wycliffe, Huss, and Savonarola, also played a role in the Reformation. They were early fighters for change, but their efforts did not fully realize the Reformation. They were children of a transitional age, and their work laid the groundwork for the Reformation. But they did not achieve the same level of systemic change as Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin. Luther, the first and most original thinker of the Reformation, developed the core ideas of the theology of the cross. Zwingli and Calvin built upon Luther's ideas, sometimes contradicting him, but always learning from him. The Reformation was not just a single movement, but a series of developments, each building on the last. Luther's ideas were the foundation, but Zwingli and Calvin took the next steps, addressing the ethical and practical questions that the Reformation raised. In understanding the Reformation, it is important to see how each figure contributed to the movement. Luther was the starting point, but Zwingli and Calvin were essential in shaping the Reformation into a more complete and practical form. They addressed the questions of how the Reformation's core ideas should be applied to the human world, leading to a more balanced and comprehensive understanding of the relationship between God and humanity. The fire of the Reformation burned brightly, but in different ways for different people. Imagine a curtain representing human life, with all its actions and inactions, good and bad. The Reformation was like a flame that touched this curtain, but the flame behaved differently for Martin Luther, Ulrich Zwingli, and John Calvin. For Luther, the flame flickered but didn't spread. He was deeply concerned with the idea that God alone is the Lord, and that faith in God's mercy and judgment is the most important thing. Luther believed that our actions, no matter how good or bad, are secondary to our faith. He saw the vertical line of God's grace intersecting with the horizontal line of human life, but he was more focused on the vertical. For Luther, the fire of faith was the most important thing, and he worried that people might think they could earn their way to heaven through good works. He wanted to make sure that faith was pure and fixed on God alone. Zwingli and Calvin, on the other hand, saw the flames spread more widely. They believed that the vertical line of God's grace should lead to a more active and engaged life. For them, the fire of faith should ignite a passion for living a life that honors God. Calvin, in particular, emphasized that the purpose of human life is to glorify God. He believed that faith should lead to good works, and that these works are essential for a life that is truly Christian. Calvin's approach was more balanced, combining a strong emphasis on faith with a clear call to action. He saw the vertical and horizontal lines as inseparable, with faith and good works working together. Luther and the Reformed had different approaches, but both were trying to understand how God's grace and human actions fit together. Luther was more cautious, always reminding people that good works are only valuable if they come from faith. Calvin was more confident, emphasizing that faith should naturally lead to a life of service and good works. This difference is important because it shows how the Reformation was not just about changing religious beliefs, but also about changing how people lived their lives. Luther's focus on faith helped people understand that they couldn't earn their way to heaven, but it sometimes made it harder for them to see the value of good works. Calvin's approach, on the other hand, made it clear that good works are a natural and necessary part of a life of faith. Both Luther and the Reformed had their strengths and weaknesses. Luther's emphasis on faith helped people understand the importance of God's grace, but it sometimes made it seem like good works didn't matter as much. Calvin's emphasis on good works helped people see the practical side of faith, but it sometimes made it seem like the fire of faith was less important. In the end, both approaches were necessary. The Reformation was about more than just changing what people believed. It was about changing how they lived. The fire of the Reformation touched the curtain of human life, but it burned in different ways for different people. Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin each contributed something important to this fire, and their ideas continue to shape how people think about faith and life today. The world of theology is a complex place, especially when we talk about the ideas of Martin Luther and John Calvin. Both men, despite their differences, were driven by a deep desire to understand God and how we should live in the world. Their teachings have shaped the way many people think about faith and ethics, but they also faced significant challenges in balancing these two aspects of life. Luther and Calvin both feared that the world might overshadow the importance of God. For Luther, this meant showing that even though we are saved by faith, we must still do good works. He believed that Christians should love and serve others, even in difficult situations. For example, he argued that it was sometimes necessary to fight or defend oneself, even though these actions might seem contrary to the peaceful nature of faith. Luther wanted to make sure that people didn't use faith as an excuse to be passive or do nothing. On the other hand, Calvin focused on the idea that God is in control of everything. He believed that God's sovereignty is so powerful that it can sometimes seem like a natural force beyond our understanding. Calvin emphasized that we must submit to God's will, even if it means doing things that might seem harsh or difficult. For Calvin, the key was to show that our actions, no matter how small, are part of God's plan. He wanted to ensure that people didn't think they could shape the world on their own without God's guidance. Both Luther and Calvin had to correct their own ideas to avoid misunderstandings. Luther had to keep reminding people that good works are important, while Calvin had to keep emphasizing that God's will is supreme. These corrections are what we see most clearly in their teachings, but we shouldn't judge them just by these features. Instead, we should look at the underlying ideas they were trying to protect. For Calvin, the main idea was the desire to shape the world for God's glory. He believed that we should actively work to make the world a better place, but always in a way that honors God. This means doing things bravely, rather than hesitating or being passive. Luther, while he also rejected passivity, was a bit more hesitant about the ethical task. He and the Reformed thinkers agreed that we shouldn't just let things happen on their own, but the Reformed were more confident about taking action. Calvin's theology is bold in its attempt to bring together different aspects of faith and life. He tried to show that knowing God and knowing ourselves are closely linked. He believed that understanding God's wisdom and goodness helps us see our own limitations. Calvin's goal was to create a unified understanding of faith and ethics, where every statement about God is also a statement about how we should live. However, even Calvin couldn't fully achieve this unity. His teachings often involved a back and forth between different ideas, showing that the unity he sought was difficult to maintain. Luther's theology, while also complex, had a different focus. He was more concerned with the idea of faith and the role of the Holy Spirit. When he talked about living a new life of obedience, he always came back to the idea that this new life comes from faith in God. Calvin, on the other hand, often emphasized the need for active obedience and submission to God's commands. Both men believed that the just lives by faith, but Calvin put more emphasis on the active part of this statement. The problem of ethics was a significant challenge for both Luther and Calvin. For Luther, ethics was a secondary concern, something that came after understanding God. For Calvin, Ethics was a primary concern, but he was careful to ensure that it didn't overshadow the importance of God. This tension is what makes their teaching so rich and complex. One way to see this tension is in their responses to the enthusiasts, who were radical reformers who believed that the kingdom of heaven was already present and that they could live a perfect life by following the Spirit. Luther, while he rejected this idea, was more sympathetic to it at first. Calvin, from the beginning, was more critical of the enthusiasts. He believed that we live in the world, not in heaven, and that God's commands are meant to guide us in our daily lives, not to create a perfect world. For Calvin, the orders of society, like marriage, work, and government, are part of God's plan. He believed that we should live within these orders, not try to escape them. This meant that even things like war, which might seem contrary to God's peace, could be part of God's plan if done in the right spirit. Calvin and Zwingli, unlike Luther, were more cautious about the idea that Christians could live a perfect life outside of these orders. In the end, both Luther and Calvin were trying to find a way to live a life that honors God. They faced different challenges and had different approaches, but their teachings continue to influence how people think about faith and ethics today. Their struggles and corrections show us that even the greatest theologians face the same challenges we do: how to live a life that is both faithful and ethical. Luther and his marriage to Katharina von Bora were quite a surprise to everyone, even his closest friends like Philip Melanchthon. For Luther, getting married was a bold act, a way to show defiance against the Catholic Church and the Pope. He believed that marriage was a good and natural thing, pleasing to God, but he also saw it as a practical step to stand against the religious authorities of his time. On the other hand, John Calvin, another key figure in the Reformation, had a different view on marriage. Calvin was more skeptical about the idea of a perfect family life, seeing it as something shadowed by original sin. However, when it came to his own marriage, Calvin approached it in a very practical way. He didn't see it as a grand statement or a leap of faith. He just saw it as a normal part of life. He trusted his friends to help him find a suitable wife, and he didn't have any illusions about it. For Calvin, marriage was a divine order meant to protect against greater evils in the world. Calvin, with his background in law, also had a very practical view of the state and its role. He saw the state's job as being like a police force, working to maintain order and care for the church. He believed that the laws of the state were confirmed by the moral laws of God, and he was very involved in shaping the laws of Geneva, both civil and religious. Calvin was not just a preacher. He was also a statesman, actively involved in the politics and governance of the city. Luther, while he also believed in the importance of government, had a more idealistic view. He saw government as a work of love, but he was also more hesitant to get involved in politics. For Luther, there was a clear separation between his role as a preacher and his role in the state. He believed that political activity could be compromising for a preacher and perhaps for all Christians. When it came to putting faith into action, Calvin and Luther had different approaches. Luther was more hesitant, often speaking deeply about faith, but not always translating it into concrete actions. Calvin, on the other hand, saw faith and ethics as closely linked. He believed that faith should be lived out in the world, even if it meant dealing with the imperfections and challenges of reality. Calvin's approach was more practical, and he was willing to take on the difficult tasks of governance and law. The Reformed tradition, which followed Calvin, emphasized the importance of living out one's faith in the world. They believed that the Christian life was about engaging with the world and its problems, not retreating from them. This was a significant shift from the more monastic and idealistic views of the past. Reformed Christians saw themselves as standing on the earth, grounded in the divine order and working to make the world a better place. This shift in thinking was not without its challenges. Calvin's emphasis on predestination and the hope of the hereafter was a way to balance the practical and the spiritual. It helped to prevent the Reformed tradition from becoming too focused on worldly success and losing sight of the ultimate goal of faith. Calvin's approach was both practical and deeply theological, and it shaped the way Reformed Christians understood their role in the world. In many ways, Zwingli and Calvin were the ones who took the Reformation to its next level. They built on Luther's insights but took them in a new direction, one that was more focused on the practical and ethical aspects of faith. They saw the Christian life as a continuous engagement with the world, a life of both action and reflection. This was a significant development in the Reformation, and it had a lasting impact on the way Christians understood their faith and their role in society. Luther and Zwingli, both born to peasant families, were key figures in the Reformation, but they had very different approaches to the challenges of their time. Luther, a heavy-blooded and troubled Thuringian, was cautious and deeply concerned about preserving the purity of the gospel. Zwingli, an awakened and orderly East Swiss, was bold and focused on applying the gospel to every aspect of life. Luther's hesitation stemmed from his fear that the gospel's message could be diluted if it was too closely intertwined with the world's systems. He believed that the gospel should remain free from any admixture of nature, law, or reason. This cautious approach led him to criticize Zwingli and the Anabaptists, who he saw as too eager to blend religion and politics. Zwingli, on the other hand, was a total humanist, a man of the Reformation, a politician, and a Swiss. He believed that the gospel should be actively applied to every area of life, from politics to society. His approach was characterized by a sense of urgency and a willingness to break through barriers to spread the gospel. This is captured in his slogan, Parum Pamus, or Let Us Break Through. Luther's complaint against Zwingli was that his boldness and lack of prayer could harm the gospel. He accused Zwingli of being presumptuous and foolhardy, leading to the gospel being blasphemed and the papacy being strengthened. Luther saw Zwingli as a non-Christian who did not teach the Christian faith correctly and was worse than a papist. Despite their differences, both Luther and Zwingli were deeply committed to the Reformation. Luther's hesitation was rooted in his faith, while Zwingli's boldness was rooted in his ethics. Luther was more cautious, always praying for God's name to be hallowed, while Zwingli was more action-oriented, ready to break through any obstacles. Their backgrounds also played a role in their different approaches. Luther came from a politically and culturally backward region, which made him more respectful of the existing systems. Zwingli, from the heart of the blossoming urban culture of the German South, had less reverence for mediatorship and provisional authority. This cultural difference contributed to their contrasting views on how the gospel should be applied. The decisive difference between them was not just in their methods, but in their fundamental beliefs. Luther believed in the need for mediation in salvation, while Zwingli held that salvation comes directly from God. This difference was evident in the Eucharistic controversy, where Luther's instinct for mediation clashed with Zwingli's monotheistic zeal. In the end, both Luther and Zwingli were driven by their deep commitment to the gospel. Luther's caution and Zwingli's boldness were both expressions of their faith, even though they often led to conflict. Understanding their differences helps us appreciate the complexity of the Reformation and the various ways in which people sought to live out their faith in a changing world. Zwingli and Calvin, two giants of the Reformation, Each had their unique ways of approaching the Christian faith and the world around them. While they shared many common goals, their methods and emphases often diverged, reflecting their distinct personalities and contexts. Zwingli, a man from the Swiss mountains, was known for his bold and direct approach. He saw the need for a radical transformation of society through the lens of the gospel. For Zwingli, Christianity was not just about personal salvation, but about the renewal of the entire world. He believed that the knowledge of God and obedience to His will were the core of true religion. This led him to challenge the abuses of the church and the state, advocating for a more just and moral society. Zwingli's rationalism, his emphasis on the intellectual understanding of faith, did not make him any less aware of the deep human sin and the need for God's grace. In fact, his rationalism drove him to action, to fight for a world that reflected God's glory. Calvin, on the other hand, was a more introspective and systematic thinker. His work, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, is a comprehensive guide to the Christian faith. Calvin's approach was marked by a deep sense of the mystery of God and the human condition. He emphasized the sovereignty of God and the doctrine of predestination, which teaches that God has chosen those who will be saved. Calvin's manliness, while different from Zwingli's, was no less strong. He was a leader who sought to build a community of believers who lived according to God's word. Both Zwingli and Calvin dedicated their major works to Francis, I of France. A powerful and complex figure of the time, Francis was a patron of the arts and learning, but he was also a ruler who was wary of the religious changes sweeping through Europe. Zwingli's dedication to Francis was bold and confident, presenting the gospel as the solution to the world's problems. He believed that the king needed the gospel to bring about true reform and peace. Calvin, in his dedication, was more measured, but still firm in his belief that the gospel was the key to a better world. The Reformation was not just a religious movement. It was a call to action, a challenge to the status quo. Zwingli and Calvin, each in their own way, sought to bring the light of the gospel to a world in need. They recognized the deep sin and brokenness of humanity, but they also saw the potential for transformation through faith in Jesus Christ. Their legacies continue to influence the way we understand and live out our faith today. In the end, Zwingli's and Calvin's efforts remind us that the Christian faith is not just about personal salvation, but about the transformation of the world. It is a call to live with courage, humility, and a deep trust in God's grace. Whether we are bold like Zwingli or systematic like Calvin, the goal remains the same: to bring the love and truth of God to every corner of our lives.